Assalamu alaikum, Ramadan Kareem. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's debate. As President Jennings said, I'm Suhail Zidane, President of the Arab American Friendship Society, which is co-sponsoring tonight's debate with the Campus Committee on Latin America and the Schoolery's Distinguished Lecture Series. We, the student sponsors of tonight's debate, believe that citizens of a democracy have a special responsibility for the actions of the government. An informed public is one that is properly equipped to assume this responsibility. Though the 1980s have come to be known as the information age, we are too often misinformed about the U.S. government's actions abroad. It is our sincere wish that tonight's debate will be an important event in each of your quests for knowledge about the government's foreign policy in Latin America and the Middle East. We hope this event will encourage a rich and ongoing dialogue in your classrooms, your homes, with your friends, and at future events like this one. Our two student organizations are dedicated to creating a U.S. foreign policy that is based on the informed respect of the people of other nations. Tonight's guests are highly qualified to address the topic of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America and the Middle East. Our first speaker is Professor Noam Chomsky. He has been a professor of linguistics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology since 1955. He is the author of more than 30 books on language, linguistics, and government. His books include American Power and the New Mandarins, At War with Asia, Toward a New Cold War, The Faithful Triangle, Turning the Tide, Pirates and Emperors, and his most recent on the Iran-Contra scandal, The Culture of Terrorism. He and Edward Herman co-authored The Political Economy of Human Rights. Noam Chomsky has a bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, and he has several honorary degrees. Professor Chomsky often criticizes what he calls government manipulation of language and facts to bend American minds into a false sense of the nation's righteousness. Our second speaker is Mr. Richard Perle. He was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy from 1981 until his resignation last May. Since leaving office, Mr. Perle has served as a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Currently, he is a contributing editor to U.S. News and World Report and is working on a novel. Richard Perle worked in the United States Senate from 1970 to 1980 for the Committee on Government Operations, the Committee on Armed Services, and its Subcommittee on Arms Control. He also worked for the late Senator Henry Jackson of Washington State. Richard Perle has a bachelor's degree from the University of Southern California and a master's degree of international studies from Princeton University. He has also studied at the London School of Economics. Mr. Perle was considered the chief architect of the Reagan administration's strategic arms policies. He had a reputation for making the national defense bureaucracy more responsive to the policies of the Reagan administration. Tonight's debate will be moderated by Professor Charles Herman, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Ohio State University Mershon Center. Let me remind you that the purpose of tonight's debate is not to declare a winner on rhetorical points, nor is it to champion or denounce various states or political movements in the two regions, although it is tempting. The purpose of tonight's debate is to learn more about the United States government's policies in Latin America and the Middle East. I turn the podium now to Professor Charles Herman. Thank you.
Thank you, Suhail, and welcome. Let me say a word about the procedure for tonight's dialogue. We have asked each speaker to make an opening statement of approximately 10 minutes. Following their opening statements, they will return to their tables and have a brief exchange, asking each other questions about their opening comments. Following that, we will entertain written questions from the audience. If you would like to write a question, my suggestion is that you prepare it during their opening remarks, and then following those initial statements, we will have ushers passing up and down the aisles to collect statements from you. This will be your first chance to introduce questions into tonight's dialogue. Backstage, we had a coin toss to decide who would go first. And the result of that is that Dr. Noam Chomsky will be our first speaker. Dr. Chomsky.
Mr. Herman didn't say that he got the wish of a lifetime by tossing a coin. He said he felt that he was really out there on the football field. When we investigate the foreign policy of any state, we find, first of all, an official doctrine that attributes to state policy honorable intent, though occasional failure, due primarily to the machinations of evil enemies. Thus, Soviet propaganda proclaims the commitment of the Soviet Union to peace, democracy, and human rights, describes the Soviet posture as defensive, and identifies U.S. imperialism as the prime source of disorder and suffering throughout the world. Official U.S. doctrine is the mirror image, and the pattern is far more pervasive, if not universal. If we investigate further, we regularly discover that official doctrine is quite inconsistent with the historical and documentary record. In our case, we are fortunate to have access to a rich documentary record for earlier years. We discover, not surprisingly, that it conforms to the pattern of evolving events and is entirely inconsistent with widely proclaimed doctrine. Now, I cannot hope to establish these conclusions in a few minutes. Rather, I'll try to sketch the main outlines of what I believe you will discover if you explore the record on your own, as I very much hope you will. I'll focus on Central America and the Middle East in the post-World War II period, but the record for earlier years and other regions is much the same. The United States emerged from World War II in a position of global power with few, if any, historical precedents, and U.S. elites were well aware of the fact. Through the 1940s, they carried out sophisticated geopolitical planning, which is on record, to fashion a global order that would be responsive to their interests. During the war, top State Department planners carried out extensive studies with the Council on Foreign Relations to develop the general outlines of global policy, later applied to particular regions. They developed the concept of what they called the Grand Area. The Grand Area was to be a region subordinated to the needs of the American economy in a framework of liberal internationalism in which it was plausibly assumed U.S. interests would dominate. The Grand Area was outlined in detail. It was to include, at a minimum, the Far East, the Western Hemisphere, and the former British Empire, including the energy reserves of the Middle East, which the State Department described as, I'm quoting, a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, the richest economic prize in the world in the field of foreign investment, referring to Saudi Arabia. At a maximum, the Grand Area should become a world system under U.S. control. Now, the Grand Area had a structure. The industrial powers were to be reconstituted, but under U.S. control and in a manner acceptable to the United States, a commitment with many significant consequences. It was understood that Europe and Japan required a hinterland. State Department studies, now declassified, explain that the Third World was to fulfill its function as a source of raw materials and markets for the industrial capitalist powers and was to be exploited, as they put it, for their reconstruction. With regard to Latin America, George Kennan, who was one of the most influential of post-war planners, explained in internal discussion that a prime concern is the protection of our raw materials. More generally, he observed that we have 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6% of its population, and we must maintain this disparity to the extent possible by force if necessary, putting aside vague and idealistic slogans such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization, preferring police states if needed over democracies that might be too liberal and too indulgent to what were called communists. The latter term has lost any substantive meaning in U.S. political rhetoric, referring simply to anyone who stands in our way. These are all quotes. These are all quotes, incidentally. The declassified documents on U.S. foreign policy in Latin America apply these ideas in detail. They explain that the primary threat we face in Latin America, I'm continuing to quote, is the trend toward nationalistic regimes that respond to popular demand for improvement in low living standards and production for domestic needs. Now that's unacceptable because the United States is committed to, quote, encouraging a climate conducive to private investment, in particular, guarantees for opportunity to earn, and in the case of foreign capital, to repatriate a reasonable return. We must therefore oppose what is regularly called ultranationalism in secret documents. That means efforts to pursue domestic needs. We must foster export-oriented production in the interest of U.S. investors. Now, it is recognized that such programs have very little appeal to the Latin American public, so the conclusion is the natural one. We must therefore gain control over the military, which can in turn control domestic opposition and overthrow civilian governments if necessary. We must also act to overcome the excessive liberalism of the Latin American countries. These ideas are outlined in the high-level documents and were applied in practice in Latin America as elsewhere. If some group or country succumbs to ultranationalism, it must be disciplined by the local security forces under U.S. control if possible, or by direct U.S. subversion or aggression. And the modern history of Latin America is to a significant extent an application of these doctrines. So a brief experiment in capitalist democracy in Guatemala was terminated in 1954 by a CIA coup installing a murderous terror state that has been maintained by regular U.S. intervention to block elections and to conduct regular repression and massacre. These operations reached a peak in the past decade with perhaps 100,000 people killed and innumerable others tortured, maimed, and starved, all of this enthusiastically supported by the Reagan administration. Meanwhile, Honduras was turned into a U.S. military base with increasing human rights violations, reaching several assassinations a week last year, and hundreds of thousands of peasants starving to death while the country exports snow peas and beef for U.S. markets, that being a typical consequence of the U.S. imposed aid and development model. In El Salvador, in the late 1970s, there was a proliferation of popular organizations, largely church-based, that threatened to lay the basis for meaningful democracy and social reforms. The Archbishop pleaded with the United States government not to send aid to the junta because it would be used, he said, to destroy the people's organizations fighting to defend their fundamental human rights. The security forces backed by the United States overcame the threat of democracy and social reform by terror and slaughter, murdering the political opposition, assassinating the Archbishop, physically destroying the independent media, invading and largely destroying the university, slaughtering tens of thousands of peasants, union leaders, and others, killing priests and nuns and intellectuals or driving them out of the country, to which they still cannot return for fear of torture and assassination. When the population was considered to be sufficiently traumatized, a so-called election was held in an atmosphere of terror and despair, macabre rumor and grisly reality, in the words of the British Parliamentary Human Rights Group that observed it. I should add that it's a staple of independent scholarship that, I quote now, while paying lip service to the encouragement of representative democracy in Latin America, the United States has a strong interest in just the reverse, apart from formal elections that are often farcical, and that the alleged U.S. concern for democracy when proper conditions have been established by repression, violence, or simply control of resources that is only a tactical device to ensure the dominance of, quote, private capitalistic enterprise linked to the United States. I'm quoting from Gordon Connell Smith in the Major Study of the Inter-American System, published by the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. As the leading U.S. academic scholar on human rights in Latin America has put it, the goal of the military authoritarian regimes sponsored by the United States has been to destroy permanently a perceived threat to the existing structure of socioeconomic privilege by eliminating the political participation of the numerical majority, principally the working or popular classes. That's what we call democracy. In the case of Nicaragua, as George Shultz frankly explained, the concern was that Sandinista success might embolden others to seek radical solutions to their problems unacceptable to the United States. Therefore, the United States followed what in fact is quite a traditional pattern, attempting to force Nicaragua into the Soviet orbit by military attack, pressures on allies and international lending institutions to refuse military and other aid, economic warfare that had had a lethal effect in a desperately poor country, ideological warfare here and abroad, including Nicaragua, where the U.S. in fact dominates the media in much of the country. The purpose was to abort the early successes of the Sandinista revolution in health, welfare, and development, and to ensure that the virus of independent development does not infect the region, to use the standard terms of, in this case, Henry Kissinger and others. There have been numerous other examples over the years. Now, policy does vary. So at the hawkish extreme, we have the Reaganites, who favor force over diplomacy and thunder that negotiations are a euphemism for capitulation if the shadow of power is not cast across the bargaining table, and that the purpose of our aid is to permit people who are fighting on our side to use more violence. That's George Shultz and Elliott Abrams, respectively. At the dovish extreme, we find Robert Pastor, who was Director of Latin American Affairs for the National Security Council under Carter. He explains that, quoting, "The United States did not want to control Nicaragua or other nations of the region, but it also did not want to allow developments to get out of control. It wanted Nicaraguans to act independently, except when doing so would affect U.S. interests adversely. Thus, Latin Americans should be free to choose as we wish them to choose." Again, what we call democracy. In practice, when they choose otherwise, we resort to what our friends in the Salvadoran military call the pedagogy of terror, sometimes in extreme forms, as under the Reagan administration, which is responsible for atrocities that merit comparison to Pol Pot. Turning briefly to the Middle East, the primary concern was the same: the fear that indigenous nationalism might threaten our effective control over one of the greatest material prizes in world history. That was understood since the 1940s to provide us with leverage over Europe and Japan. The National Security Council recognized in 1958 that, quoting, "a logical corollary of our opposition to radical nationalism would be support for Israel as a loyal ally." Now, this conception of Israel as a strategic asset became established in ways I can't review here, particularly under the Nixon Doctrine, with Israel and Iran under the Shah assigned the role of cops on the beat, as the Defense Secretary Melvin Laird put it at the time. Israel also increasingly came to provide services for U.S. power in Africa and Asia, but particularly in Latin America, as in Central America over the past decade, where Israel has served, in effect, as a mercenary state within the impressive international terror network that was partially exposed during the Iran-Contra hearings. These are the essential factors that have led the United States to block a political settlement to the Arab-Israeli conflict since 1971, a settlement that's backed by a broad international consensus that favors a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized borders, based on the principle that the indigenous population of the former Palestine and the Jewish settlers who largely displaced them both have the right of national self-determination. Now, such a settlement, which has long been feasible, is opposed by Khomeini, by Gaddafi, by the United States and Israel. U.S.-Israeli power has been decisive in blocking it. This policy, not too well understood here, but easily documented from the record, and traceable back to Henry Kissinger, that guarantees further escalation of the cycle of harsh repression, resistance, more repression and more resistance in the occupied territories, with the likelihood of regional wars and possible superpower confrontation, as has repeatedly threatened since 1967. Now, these are, I think, the main outlines of what you will discover if you review the ample documentary and historical record, a record that is very remote from official pieties, as we regularly discover in investigating international affairs and their ideological cover.
Thank you. And now our second opening statement from Mr. Richard Perle.
There is a story told, perhaps apocryphal, but perhaps true, about Machiavelli on his deathbed. A priest was summoned, leaned over to the ailing philosopher and said, "Are you prepared to reject the devil and embrace the Lord?" There was no response from Machiavelli, and so the priest repeated his question. Again, no response. He asked a third time, and this time Machiavelli raised his head slightly from the pillow and he said, "Father," he said, "this is no time to be making new enemies." And I don't want to make new enemies this evening, but I can't allow what I've just heard to stand unquestioned. So perhaps I might begin at the very beginning, with the notion implied by Professor Chomsky that there is a sense in which Soviet propaganda, which characterizes the United States and its allies as imperialist, is somehow mirrored, the mirror image, I think was his phrase, by what he calls American propaganda. I would hope that Professor Chomsky would acknowledge that there is at least one fundamental difference between propaganda in this country and propaganda in the Soviet Union, and that is that in the Soviet Union there is a monopoly disposed of by the state over what is said and written, what is presented over the air, for which there is no comparison in a society of multiple voices, one indeed that produces Professor Chomsky's books in large numbers, publishes his articles, and invites him to participate on the airwaves, as C-SPAN is now doing. Now, I listened with interest to Professor Chomsky's account of the State Department planners. I'm not quite sure who they are, with the exception of George Kennan, and I presume the references to Kennan were meant to include him in the group of State Department planners. State Department planners who, in Mr. Chomsky's view, planned in the post-war, immediate post-war period, for a grand area, an imperial American policy. In the Far East, he said, in Europe and in the Middle East. And yet, if we look at American policy in the post-war period, what was its principal thrust? Its principal thrust was the establishment of the Marshall Plan to help rebuild the economies of Europe, assistance to Japan to rebuild Japan along democratic lines, indeed the reconstruction of a Japanese constitution, and massive disarmament of American military forces. That is the foreign policy that Professor Chomsky would have you believe was designed to implement a vast imperial ambition. It would be among the most extraordinary miscalculations in the history of international politics to base an imperial policy on the reconstruction of other powers and the dismantlement of one's own military establishment. And yet that was the essence of American policy in the post-war period. Our policies, Professor Chomsky would have you believe, were intended to produce American control. But where do you see signs of American control in relation, say, to our principal allies in the world? I had the privilege for more than 6 years of representing the United States, among other places, in meetings of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an organization of 16 independent nations. And I can assure you that there wasn't a representative from any other nation around that table who would for a moment accept the notion that the United States controlled the policy of his country. When we deliberated, as we frequently did, in order to produce the statements that from time to time we made on a consensus basis, we had to persuade others to accept language that they could sign, and frequently, indeed most of the time, we were only able to achieve consensus by making essential compromises so that everyone was content with what became the policy of this collective organization. Hardly a system of control. Now, I haven't seen the State Department documents to which Professor Chomsky refers. And without questioning that such documents exist, I would only caution you as a practitioner who has worked inside the government not to trust too much on every piece of paper that's produced in the Department of State. I developed something of a reputation for disregarding all pieces of paper produced by the Department of State. And the fact is that the Department of State, like most other American institutions, contains a wide diversity of views and opinions, some of which one would wish to be associated with, others that one would most certainly not wish to be associated with. And I would take with a grain of salt the words of individuals just because they happen to constitute State Department documents. We are talking about the views of individuals frequently. Sometimes they may reflect policy and sometimes they may not. But this notion that one can go through the archives and on the basis of a document here and a document there, on the basis of plans and dreams that sounded to me in many cases quite fantastic, derive from that the essence of American policy, whether it is in Europe or the Far East or the Middle East or anywhere else, can only be the view of one who has never worked inside a governmental bureaucracy. Now, I find curious indeed the underlying thesis, and I take this to be the underlying thesis of Mr. Chomsky's presentation, that the United States somehow has an interest, that the United States and its citizens, or its elite, if he would care to put it that way, would somehow benefit from the destruction of democracy. It's a totally unproven assertion. It has been my impression over the years that the United States benefits most when it is able to exist in a world of some reasonable stability and prosperity. And democracy, as far as we know, is by far the most productive system in the history of mankind for the production of both stability and prosperity, and we would be fools to promote any other political doctrine anywhere else in the world. Now, this is not to say that we have not found ourselves from time to time in situations where our immediate interests happen to lay with a government in power that did not meet our standards of democracy. We live unfortunately in a world in which there are other countries, including some quite powerful countries, who do not believe that their interests lie with the expansion of democracy, but believe rather that their interests, and perhaps indeed their future, lies with the expansion of communist rule, in particular the sort of communist rule that might be directed or substantially influenced from the Soviet Union. And I wouldn't deny for a moment, I'd be foolish to deny it, and you would be foolish to fail to understand it, that there have been and will in future doubtless be occasions when the United States, in the interests of protecting its broad interests and in the long-term interest of promoting democracy around the world, will find it necessary to resist communist expansion by finding itself in opposition to governments that, if they were not contained, would contribute to that potential growth of communist power and influence. And far from what Professor Chomsky has to say, the notion that the United States, as a deliberate policy, to use his words, attempted to force Nicaragua into the Soviet orbit, when we had every interest in Nicaragua moving out of any orbit, and indeed assisted in the transition from Somoza to what we thought, what we hoped, what many believed would be a democratic revolution. The notion that it was in our interest to force them into the arms of the Soviets is is such an astounding one, I hardly know how to respond to it except to suggest that even the early history of the American relationship with the Sandinista regime makes it clear that we sought to assist that regime, we gave aid to it, and our disappointment is a disappointment that is mirrored by leaders of the Contra movement, many of whom were part of the original revolution against Somoza, who fought to install a Sandinista revolution that they believed would be a democratic revolution, and they have been bitterly disappointed as it has become increasingly clear that far from being a democratic revolution, it is a totalitarian one. Now, Professor Chomsky says, in passing almost, that the Reagan administration has been responsible for atrocities comparable to those of Pol Pot, if I understood him correctly. This is, and he will have later in this program an opportunity to elaborate. But that strikes me as an extraordinary statement. Many of you are familiar with the atrocities of the Pol Pot regime, in which hundreds of thousands of people have died, and in many cases in a particularly brutal way. The result of turbulence in a region of the world where not so many years ago Professor Chomsky was addressing audiences even larger than this one, I dare say, with a view to discouraging American involvement in that part of the world, and now we're out of it and you see the result. You see the result in the people who take to the sea in boats that frequently sink to escape the Vietnam, whose independence Professor Chomsky thought was a desirable outcome. You see it indeed in what is going on now in Cambodia, in the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, which is sustained and nurtured by Soviet assistance, both monetary and military. Now, shifting for a moment to the Middle East, the United States, Professor Chomsky says, has blocked a political settlement in the Middle East since 1971. As we look at the recent history of the Middle East, perhaps the only progress toward stability and a settlement in the Middle East has been that diplomatic activity that was nurtured by the United States, and I have in mind in particular the Camp David Accord, which at least ended the mortal hostility of Israel and Egypt, which threatened and indeed brought about wars, but threatened wars of even greater severity and destruction. It is only a step, and it does not go nearly far enough. But to accuse the United States of blocking movement toward a settlement when it has in fact been the instrument of such movement toward a settlement as we have had strikes me as bizarre indeed. Now, the simple fact is that it is very difficult to persuade our friends in Israel that they should sit down at the negotiating table and conclude an agreement in which they would give up territory that now provides some measure of physical protection in negotiations with an organization that remains to this day pledged in its covenant, in its constitution, in its fundamental articles of existence, that remains dedicated to the destruction of a Jewish state in Palestine. Negotiation from time to time, and in many cases, can be the best hope for the settlement of a political dispute, and often the only hope for the settlement of a political dispute. But one cannot ask one's friends to negotiate with an entity that is committed to the destruction of one's friends. And time and again, the Palestine Liberation Organization has been challenged to revise its covenant, to disestablish the notion that there can be no Jewish state in Palestine, and time and again it has refused to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, as we continue the evening, ask yourself whether the adumbration of documents that you haven't seen and I haven't seen, and the weight and the consequences of which it is impossible to estimate, bears up against your impression of where the United States has been in the post-war period and your sense of what the United States represents both at home and around the world. Thank you.
In a moment, I'm going to ask Professor Chomsky if he'd like to put a couple of questions to Mr. Perle. But before I do that, let me say that now would be an opportunity for you to jot down a question and to pass it towards the aisle closest to you. We will have several people who will be collecting these questions. Let me point out that there are people who are not in the auditorium who are following this dialogue on radio or television, and therefore they will not be able to hear were you to ask a question from the audience. So we're asking that you jot down your questions and pass them to the nearest aisle. You'll have another chance to do that a little later on, but this would be a good opportunity. Professor Chomsky, a couple of questions.
Well, actually, I think let me make a comment first. When Mr. Perle said that he preferred to go second, and I said I had no objection, I assumed that we would keep to the usual format of such discussions, namely that we would each make a statement expressing our opinion. That's not exactly what happened. The format was changed. I made a statement, and you heard a rebuttal. That's a different arrangement. That being the case, I will take this occasion, if I may, to respond to the rebuttal, which in my view was not a proper way to proceed. Let me just comment a little bit on some of those remarks. First, Mr. Perle pointed out that the Soviet Union and the United States are internally very different societies. I absolutely agree, and anybody who can think their way out of a paper bag will notice that that has no relation whatsoever to my comment that in every state you look at, whether it's the Soviet Union or the United States or anyone else, you'll find official pieties, and you'll find a historical and documentary record, and they want to have anything to do with each other. With regard to the reconstruction of Europe, although that wasn't my main topic, I'd be very much interested in talking about it if someone would like to raise questions. Let me just stress again what I said. The United States planned in the highest level planning documents during the war and later to reconstruct Europe in the context of liberal internationalism, in which it was assumed that U.S. interests would prevail, given the relations of power. It's exactly what happened. For example, U.S. investment in Europe skyrocketed. The United States was deeply concerned that if the United States did not reconstruct Japan and Europe, they would associate themselves with our enemies. Japan, it was assumed, would associate itself with China, with the Soviet Union. We had to block this, therefore we had to reconstruct them under our own control. In particular, the control over Middle East oil was always regarded explicitly as a lever to ensure, as George Kennan put it, a veto power over them. Notice that these policies of liberal internationalism in fact worked. Let me stress that the documents that I was citing, of course they're a small selection, were not random comments by this or that person. I was quoting the the most comprehensive statements of the policy planning staff of the State Department and the National Security Council. The statements I quoted are reiterated over and over again, often verbatim, consistently in the documentary record. And they, in fact, as you will discover if you look, represent the core of thinking in the 1940s and the early 1950s when the framework of the current world order was established. As far as Europe was, Mr. Perle is correct when he says that the United States fosters stability and prosperity of a very special kind, the kind in which we can prosper. So it's the kind of stability in which, for example, Honduras exports snow peas and beef, but doesn't feed its own population. And we also foster democracy, namely the kind that we like. So, for example, in the late 1940s, the United States intervened in Japan and in Europe to conduct a reverse course, which destroyed the anti-fascist resistance, which repressed labor, which broke up unions, which broke up the independent media, which reconstructed business control, and in fact restored pretty much the old order, but now within the framework of U.S. power. And in fact, that explains the kind of democracy we want, democracy under business control linked to us. The aid to Nicaragua that Mr. Perle mentioned is a perfect example. The aid did not go to Nicaragua. It went to the business sector in Nicaragua, to the private sector, in an effort to block the Sandinista revolution. Mr. Perle regards it as astonishing that we attempted to drive Nicaragua into the Soviet orbit. Here comes a question. I would like to ask what you think are the consequences of organizing a military force based on the National Guard with the aid of Argentine neo-Nazis to attack a country, then preventing them from getting any military aid from abroad, turning down their request to us for arms, blocking aid from international institutions, launching economic warfare, including finally a blockade. When you attack a country and you prevent them from getting arms from anywhere else except the Soviet Union, exactly what does one think is going to happen? Does it take a genius to conclude that they're going to rely on the Soviet Union? When we instituted that blockade in 1985, Nicaraguan trade with the Soviet Union was in fact 20%, with the whole East Soviet bloc, including Cuba, about the same as ours, much less than Europe and much less than the Third World. The purpose of the blockade, as the purpose of the attack, was obvious. It would have the intended consequence of forcing the reliance that we require as a retrospective justification for attacking them for quite different reasons. Now, as to the atrocities that are comparable to Pol Pot, again, I urge that you look at U.S. government records. So, for example, the CIA has a demographic study of the Pol Pot regime in which they conclude, they much underestimate in my view, but they conclude that 50 to 100,000 people were killed. More serious estimates put it at several hundred thousand, and many hundred thousands more died from starvation, disease, etc. That's roughly comparable to what happened in Central America in the last decade in scale and in character. Read the reports of the human rights organizations, of the church and so on, and you will find that the torture, atrocities, mutilation, and so on in Central America is exactly on the style of Pol Pot. Check it and see. As to my calling for the United States to get out of Vietnam in Indochina, let me recall the facts. Through the 1960s, I did call on the United States to terminate its aggression against South Vietnam and its invasion of all of Indochina, exactly as I call on the Soviet Union to terminate its aggression in Afghanistan. By 1970, I pointed out that the effect of U.S. policy was going to be to guarantee that North Vietnam would control all of Indochina, for the simple reason that by that time we had destroyed the indigenous forces in the other countries. It's pretty much what happened. The United States physically destroyed 3 countries. They've undergone a disaster that there's nothing in our history to compare with back to the Black Plague, and in fact you do see the effect of that. If the Russians continue in Afghanistan, you'll see similar effects for similar reasons. As to the Middle East, Mr. Perle says it's bizarre to say that the United States has blocked a diplomatic settlement since 1971. Let me repeat what I said. The United States has blocked a political settlement based on the principle that both national groups have the right to national self-determination. In fact, we even went beyond that. In February 1971, when President Sadat of Egypt offered a full peace treaty to Israel, which offered nothing to the Palestinians on the internationally recognized borders, a proposal which incidentally was virtually identical to official, though not operative, U.S. government policy, the Rogers Plan, Israel refused it, and the United States backed them in that refusal. That led directly to the 1973 war, as was obvious at the time, and constantly reported to Henry Kissinger by oil company executives, ambassadors, and so on. After the 1973 war, the United States recognized that Egypt was not a basket case. It couldn't simply be dismissed. The United States therefore accepted Sadat's long-standing offers to become a U.S. client and moved to exclude Egypt from the conflict. That's the shuttle diplomacy and ultimately Camp David. The purpose and the obvious consequences were that with the Arab deterrent removed, Israel would be free to, that's the biggest Arab military force in the Arab world, Israel would be free to integrate the occupied territories and to attack its northern neighbor, with a huge increase in U.S. aid, reaching about 50% of total aid at that point. Predicted at the time exactly what happened, now acknowledged in retrospect as what happened, as of course it must. That's the one supposed contribution of the United States towards peace. In January 1976, the United States vetoed a Security Council resolution advanced by the Arab states and the PLO for a two-state political settlement. I won't go through the whole record, but that's continued up until today. What I said is precisely accurate. As for Israel's needing security, here again I urge you to take a look at the documentary record. One learns a lot from it, and you learn a lot from the fact that certain people don't want you to look at it. There's a very extensive documentary record of... There's a very extensive documentary record in Hebrew, if any of you have access to it, of Israeli government planning and thinking, cabinet meetings, etc., from 1967 through 1973. I've gone through it in detail. That's the period in which the rejectionist policy was established, peace was rejected, and so on. If you go through it, you'll find virtually no reference to security. That wasn't a concern. The reason is explained repeatedly by Israeli military leaders, General Harkabi, many others. The issue is not security. The issues that what you see discussed there are, for example, you see much more discussion of water, access to water, than you see to security. The point is that Israel does not want to abandon those territories. Now, you may say they have a right to keep them or whatever, but it's not an issue of security. Israel is much more insecure trying to hold a hostile population inside it than it would be under a political settlement which would reduce tensions and leave a demilitarized Palestinian state on its borders contained within a hostile Israeli-Jordanian military alliance. Whatever the issue may be, it's not security, nor is it the PLO covenant. The PLO, in my view, should withdraw the covenant, but in 1977 it already announced that the covenant would have no consequences for interstate relations, any more than statements of the Zionist organization do. Israel was stated that the PLO in the covenant is dedicated to the destruction of Israel, yes, but they've said that it doesn't affect interstate relations. However, Israel is dedicated to the destruction of Palestinian nationalism, and it implements that dedication. Furthermore, quite apart from the actions, the official documents of the Zionist movement up until today still call for that. In fact, they even call, like for example, the governing Likud party has repeatedly, again a few weeks ago, announced that its claims to Jordan remain in place. It has not abandoned its claims to Jordan. David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, back at the time of partition, all the way back, in fact, repeatedly made it clear that there are no, as David Ben-Gurion put it, the bounds of Zionist aspirations cannot be controlled by any foreign element. They will be determined by what we do. As the 1949 war was continuing, he stated that we will not establish borders because we will determine the borders by our own actions.
Professor Chomsky, let me break in at that point.
Okay.
And there are a couple of things I'd like to pull out of Professor Chomsky's remarks and ask you, Mr. Perle. The first one that he formed as a kind of a question is, what should we expect with regards to Nicaragua when, as we did in 1985, engage in a blockade and, in effect, engage in aggressive actions against Nicaragua? Did we not push them into looking to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe for assistance?
Well, I believe that Nicaragua was already not only looking to the Soviet Union for assistance, but receiving it, and receiving it on a sizable scale, using equipment received from the Soviet Union and from Cuba in El Salvador in order to try to produce a change of government in El Salvador. We started out, the Carter administration started out, some of us were a little dubious about that policy, but nevertheless it started out well disposed toward the new Sandinista administration. I think that's undeniable. Its attitude toward the Sandinistas began to change when it became evident that the Sandinistas were not putting in place the sort of democratic administration that one had expected, and indeed that a number of the Contra leaders, for that reason, ultimately left the Sandinista leadership and decided, and this must have been a bitter disappointment, that they would again have to take up arms in order to attempt to realize their ambitions for the democratization of Nicaragua. And what we have in Nicaragua today is a police state. I don't think there's any question about that. I don't see any likelihood that it's going to change. But what I found most peculiar about Professor Chomsky's view, and perhaps he'd care to say more about it, is why he believes it is in the interest of the United States to drive Nicaragua into the arms of the Soviet Union, since he believes that that's what we did. As one listens to Professor Chomsky, I think one can only come to the conclusion that the United States is led and has been led for the last 40 years by people who haven't the slightest idea of how to promote their own intelligent interests. Because as he describes both our policies which he derives from documents, and I can only repeat that, unless I'm mistaken, you've never served in government, because anyone who would attempt to derive the conclusions you do from the kinds of documents you've been reading simply doesn't understand what it means to formulate policy in a real government.
Well, your question was...
If you accept the general thrust of Professor Chomsky's view, then I think you have to come to the conclusion that the leadership of the United States for the last 40 years has acted contrary to the interests that he says they had established as their principal interest. That was the prosperity of the United States in a world of liberal internationalism. I happen to think liberal internationalism is a pretty good thing, and Professor Chomsky obviously doesn't. I believe it is conducive to the prosperity of the United States and to the prosperity of the world, broadly speaking. Professor Chomsky is troubled by the fact that Honduras exports snow peas. He's mentioned it twice. I presume they export snow peas because there's a market abroad for snow peas, and it seems to me, on the whole, a good thing for countries that are able to produce and export and earn income thereby to do so. The fact that there is poverty in Honduras is not an argument against building up Honduran export industries. I don't know what that bell is meant to signify.
Maybe that's time for me to...
Well, it is true that the Palestinians have made it a part of their covenant that Israel has no legitimate right to exist as a Jewish state in Palestine, and if it were up to him, he would change that, and while they haven't changed it, they've sort of disavowed it, and so we mustn't take it too seriously. I do think that misses the point. There is a reason why the PLO has not revised its covenant to change that provision, and the reason is that it would tear the PLO apart if they attempted to do so, because a significant element within the Palestine Liberation Organization is dedicated to the destruction of a Jewish state in Palestine. I don't know where Professor Chomsky stands on the existence of a Jewish state in Palestine. I happen to believe that it is right and proper that there should be a Jewish state in Palestine. I am not, as a consequence of that, unsympathetic to the situation of the Palestinians, but a solution, when one is found, has to be one that guarantees some reasonable security for the Israelis after what the Israelis have been through. And as you look at the turbulence in the Middle East, it seems to me understandable that any Israeli government would want to move with extreme caution in concluding agreements that entail a significant sacrifice in terms of physical security, that is, by giving up territory that acts as a buffer, in exchange for promises originating with an organization that remains dedicated to Israel's destruction.
Professor Chomsky, did you wish to respond?
Well, I was asked, several questions came up. Let me deal with them one at a time. Why is it in the interest of the United States to drive Nicaragua into the hands of the Soviet Union? That's transparent, actually. First, let's establish again that was the policy of the United States. Simply to review the record, the Carter administration tried very hard to, first of all, it supported Somoza until virtually the end, long after the Nicaraguan business community, our natural allies, turned against him, and after our other Central American allies turned against him. When it became impossible to support Somoza, because he was obviously gone, the Carter administration tried to maintain the National Guard in power. In fact, it called upon the Organization of American States to intervene to maintain the National Guard in power in a policy that Latin Americans called Somocismo without Somoza. That failed. The Latin American countries refused to go along. After that, the Carter administration tried in every way first to rescue the National Guard. So, for example, they sent American planes under Red Cross marking, it's a violation of the laws of war, incidentally, into Managua to take National Guard officers out. The Contras were reconstituted on the border. They were quickly picked up by the Reagan administration and turned into a terrorist force to attack Nicaragua. Meanwhile, the Carter administration offered aid, but not to the Sandinista government. Let me repeat that. That aid went to the private sector. It was, again, a last-ditch effort to try to prevent the Sandinistas from coming into power. Now, maybe the Carter administration would have made some arrangement. We can't tell. But when the Reagan administration came in, that was finished. They launched an attack against Nicaragua almost immediately, both a military attack and an economic attack. They prevented our allies from sending aid to Nicaragua. So, for example, there was pressure put on France to stop them from providing arms. The story about arms in El Salvador, I'll go into it if you like, but there's nothing to it. Both economic warfare and military warfare increased. International lending institutions were pressured to stop giving aid. An embargo was called at a time when Nicaraguan trade with the entire Soviet bloc was roughly comparable to ours. Again, I say it does not take a genius to figure out that the result of these policies will be to force them to rely on the only group we allow them to rely on to defend themselves against our attack. So assuming something short of total stupidity, that was the purpose, since it was obviously the perfectly predictable consequence, and the consequence that to a limited extent took place.
But
that's now why I didn't quite answer yet why we wanted to do it. Well, the answer to that's obvious. In fact, it's a consistent pattern. We did it when we wanted to overthrow Guatemalan democracy. We did it when we wanted to overthrow Dominican democracy in 1965. If you want to attack and destroy a political system, there's a way to do it within our political culture. Try to show that it's an agency of the Soviet Union. Once you've succeeded in establishing that, then you can attack and destroy it. This is a record that has been replayed so many times since 1947, when Dean Acheson pioneered it with a totally fabricated account, as he more or less conceded, of the Soviet intervention, which didn't exist in Greece at the time of the Truman Doctrine. As he knew and as we now know, the Soviet intervention was an attempt to try to get the Greek guerrillas to stop interfering with an imperial settlement that they had made with Britain, which granted Britain control over Greece. That's not even debatable anymore. That record's been replayed over and over. The Soviet Union, incidentally, does exactly the same thing when they want to invade Hungary or Czechoslovakia or whatever. They argue that they're defending it from CIA machinations, and they try to show that they're working for the CIA, etc. Other powers do the same thing. It's an obvious way we should do it. Now, was U.S. policy as inept as Mr. Perle suggests? On the contrary, it was extremely successful. The policy of liberal internationalism reconstituted Europe and Japan on the old order, on the old conservative order. Remember what that meant. That meant eliminating, often destroying by violence, the anti-fascist resistance in much of the world. It meant destroying labor unity. It meant blocking efforts at radical democracy that had substantial support in both Europe and Japan, particularly striking in Japan with the reverse course in 1947. It meant reconstituting something like the old order under U.S. control with enormous profits, just enormous profits for U.S. corporations, huge expansion of investment, of exploitation of the third world and so on. All of this an enormous and maybe unprecedented success. Now, the Third World, remember, had a very definite role in that system. Its role was to fulfill its function as a source of raw materials and markets for this conservative, quasi-democratic order that we had reconstructed by pressure and force, in fact, in Europe and Japan. And it did that. When I mention Honduras, that's just a symbol. That's a symbol of U.S. development policies everywhere. I mentioned Honduras because there was only 1 minute. But the point is not that Honduras is exporting snow peas. The point is that Honduras is not producing food. The effect of U.S. policies, take the Alliance for Progress. The effect of the Alliance for Progress policies in Honduras, in Costa Rica, in Nicaragua, everywhere, was to lead to what American economists called an economic miracle. Gross national product went up, and so did child malnutrition. the death toll, misery, and suffering. And the reason is when you impose, by force, of course, a development model in which production for domestic use is replaced by agro-export for foreign use, people starve, and you make profits. So you take land that was used for subsistence agriculture, you turn it over to ranchers linked to American agribusiness or the Hanover Company and so on to produce specialized vegetables and flowers and beef for pet foods and for the American markets. GNP goes up, profits go up, a small sector of the local economy profits, and the population plummets into disaster. That's why there have been hundreds of thousands of people starving to death in Honduras in the last years, and in fact the same story, pretty much the same story was true throughout most of Central America. Take Nicaragua. Nicaragua did have an economic miracle in the 1960s and 70s. Similarly, child malnutrition doubled, and the general misery vastly increased. That laid the basis of the crisis of Central America. And similar things are true in much of the Third World. That's the effect of this development model.
Let's ask Mr. Perle about that. You give me a response. The international liberalism that you said you liked, he's saying produces an economic model that it produces crops for export, which profit only a small sector and produces indigenous wide-scale poverty and starvation.
Well, I think this is garbage, of course, is the whole notion, the whole notion that American policy consists of a group of people sitting in the State Department and figuring out how we can exploit the rest of the world, which is, in essence, what Professor Chomsky is asserting. It ignores the fact that I don't know what development model he has in mind. I imagine it's a Marxist development model.
No. The American model we impose, I'm speaking of if you want to know what I have in mind, it's very simple. Independence. I would like...
No, wait a minute.
I would like to explain... Let me just say again, it's the same development model.
That's not a development model.
No, because I don't think...
Is there any country that has followed the development model that you would recommend?
I think you're missing my point. Neither the United States, nor the Soviet Union, nor Britain, or anyone else has a right to ram some development model down somebody's throat. I can tell you what I think, and in an academic seminar we could talk about how development should take place, but that's not to the point here. The question is whether the countries of the world and the peoples of the world are allowed to pick their own development model. That's the question. Of
course they are, and in fact, if you look at the countries that have been most prosperous and most successful, that have picked their own path, and whose people have prospered and whose institutions are democratic and flourishing, they are, for the most part, countries that have maintained close and friendly relations with the United States. And if you look at the Pacific Basin, for example, the success stories in the Pacific Basin are countries like Taiwan and Japan and Korea. You can look at Singapore, you can look at Hong Kong. The development model that has worked there has worked with very substantial results and to the benefit of the people involved. They are independent in every sense. I notice how you slipped in quasi-democratic as a description of Europe, which... I don't know exactly what you have in mind.
I'll explain.
What explains the quasi, but it is a relevant question which you've dodged as to what development model you have in mind, because I think what I detect underneath all of this is a simple equation of independence with a development model that you happen to prefer that is something other than a capitalist model of development. And I think you ought to tell us what it is.
Well, you see, you're assuming that I have your values, and I don't have your values.
I'm quite sure you don't.
Let me continue. I have my own ideas about how development takes place, but my point is that neither I, nor you, or the U.S. government, or the Soviet government, or anyone else has the right to ram those ideas down someone else's throat.
No one's quarreling about that.
If we were to have a discussion on development models, I'd be perfectly happy to discuss it. It's just not relevant here. In fact, let's take a look at the development models that you say have worked. If you look at them, you'll notice something very interesting. The ones you mentioned are the right ones. They worked in a particular way, the Pacific Basin. But in order to understand those development models, you have to look at the history of those regions. See, history and documents and so on really are important. You can't just spin this stuff out of your head. Now, the countries that have developed in the Pacific Basin are in fact the countries that are the former Japanese colonies. And there's a reason for that. Japanese colonialism was very brutal, but it was quite different from European colonialism. You look back at the record, you'll find it operated in a different way. Japanese colonialism, while extremely brutal, actually carried out development. And in fact, if you look at the history of these countries since the period of Japanese colonization, you'll see that development took place, industrial development in fact, under conditions of extraordinary brutality. It then, of course, stopped during the Second World War and post-World War period, and then took off again where it was under pretty much the same model, namely a state-controlled, directed economy, which is what they have. We call it capitalism. It has very little to do with capitalism. Well, that's a particular kind of development model. It didn't just come by free choice. I mean, in Korea, say, it came after 10 years of war. The Korean War started in 1945, remember. In 1945, when the United States intervened in South Korea, and the Soviet Union came into North Korea, what happened was that a civil war began. And in South Korea, about 100,000 people were killed before what we call the Korean War broke out, with plenty of border conflict across the borders. The Russians pulled out, incidentally. That's the basis for the Korean War. Then came the fighting, the destruction of Korea, the control over it by the conquerors. Well, that wasn't what you may say it's good or bad or whatever. It certainly wasn't free. In Taiwan, the development was carried out under, in fact, a conquering army, the Kuomintang army. And similarly, in Indonesia, let's say, the development, again, wasn't just free. I mean, in Indonesia, there was a military coup in 1965, strongly supported by the United States. 700,000 people approximately were slaughtered within 4 months, mostly landless peasants. That destroyed the only mass-based political party in the country. And then came with U.S. enthusiastic support, I should say, then came a certain kind of development model, one which opened the country up to exploitation by Canada, by Japan, by the United States, and a certain kind of development, if you like. All of these are forms of development, but they didn't come by free choice. They came by forceful imposition, just as the development in Hungary didn't come by free choice. It came by forceful imposition of a different kind, undoubtedly. The kind of, the forms of U.S. intervention are different from the forms of intervention of other countries for all sorts of reasons, but it's rammed down people's throats. It's not their choice. When moves began to take place in a way inconsistent with our officially stated goals, namely when the threat of ultranationalism began to develop, independent regimes responsive to the demands of the population for improvement in their living standards and diversification of production, we have repeatedly intervened by force to block it. We did so in Guatemala since 1954, over and over again. We did it in the Dominican Republic. We've done it in the Southern Cone. We've done it throughout, extensively in Central America in the current period. We're doing it now in the Philippines. There's case after case after case. Now, let me separate.
I'm going to turn now to some questions from you. The first one, what would you consider a viable alternative to the current Palestinian situation? Would the current occupied territory serve as an adequate sovereign state with a government independent from Jewish influence? Professor Perle, can we start with you? All right, Mr. Perle. You want to join the university?
Well, I'm a lot less enthusiastic about that than I was an hour ago. I don't have an answer. And I think I probably differ from Professor Chomsky, who has an answer for absolutely everything. And we'll tell it to you at great length.
All right. What about the Palestinian situation?
I really don't have a solution, except to say that a precondition for any solution must be a recognition on the part of all parties of the legitimacy of all parties. That is, you cannot build a political agreement on the premise that a Jewish state in Palestine is illegitimate. It isn't going to happen. And if it did happen, it would not be stable or secure. So that seems to me the necessary first step. Professor Chomsky has all but acknowledged that he too thinks that the PLO ought to recognize the right of Israel to exist as an independent Jewish state in Palestine, and I hope he has more influence with them than he's likely to have with the makers of American foreign policy.
What about Professor Chomsky, what would you consider a viable alternative to the current Palestinian situation?
Well, there's an obvious viable alternative, and the international consensus that I described has in fact outlined it. Most of Europe, most of the aligned countries, the major Arab states, the mainstream of the PLO for well over a decade, have called for a two-state political settlement arrived at by negotiations leading to mutual recognition. PLO doesn't have to wait for my advice, which I wouldn't give them anyway, to call for mutual recognition of Israel and a new Palestine state. They've been calling for that for years. Now, if you listen to Mr. Perle carefully, you'll notice that a word was sneaked in there. That was the word recognition of their legitimacy. Now, that they will not do. And notice that there's an interesting diplomatic history with regard to the Middle East. The United States has been trying to block a settlement for a long time. After it became obvious that the PLO and the Arab states were quite willing to accept the existence of Israel, that is, to achieve a two-state settlement with recognized borders, with international guarantees, with mutual recognition, and so on. After it became obvious that this was possible, it was necessary to up the ante a notch. And what happened was, and here you take a look at recent American diplomatic history, again I urge you to look at the documents, very informative, you'll notice that the position was changed. It was not enough for them to recognize Israel. They had to recognize the legitimacy of Israel, or the right to exist of Israel. Now, right to exist is something that doesn't exist in international law. No state recognizes the right of any other state to exist. Mexico does not recognize the right of the United States.
Question the rights of other states to exist.
That's not true. We reject outright the right of the Soviet Union to exist in its present borders. That's why we have a captive nations week every year. Mexico does not, and we may be perfectly right in doing that. Mexico does not recognize the right of the United States to exist within its present borders, which happen to include a third of Mexico. In fact, in the international system, there is a notion of recognition of a state, but there is no notion of recognition of the legitimacy of a state. To call on the Palestinians to accept this new concept is to ask them to accept not only that there's a state in an area which they regard as their home, they're willing to recognize that, but to recognize the right of that state to have dispossessed them. Now, of course, they're not going to accept that, nor should they. There is no such thing in international affairs, and the effort to try to obtain it is pointless and absurd. Let me now make clear that while the PLO has, with varying degrees of ambiguity, but often with great precision, I should say, called for a political settlement along the lines I mentioned, Israel and the United States have been equally clear, namely in rejecting any such political settlement. The United States and Israel reject not only do they reject the right of the Palestinians to self-determination, they reject any manifestation of that right. In fact, U.S.-Israeli rejectionism is so extreme that the United States and Israel will not even permit the Palestinians to select their own representatives for eventual negotiations. That's really extreme. If somebody had come along in 1947 and said the Jews in Palestine can be represented, but not by the Zionists, we would have called that a regression to Nazism, correctly, and the same principle holds here. The fact that the PLO has engaged in terror, as have all, to my knowledge, other nationalist movements, including George Washington, obviously not to the point. By those standards, we would have rejected the Zionist movement, which engaged in extreme terror. In fact, the current Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, was the head of one of the leading terrorist groups, the group that assassinated the UN Ambassador Pope Bernadotte, among many other atrocities, and was the author in 1947 of a pamphlet in which he not only advocated terror, but said that there is no moral barrier whatsoever to the use of terror, nor can there be. Well, yeah, that's what national movements are like, but that doesn't stop us from dealing with them. And it doesn't stop us, we're like that too. All of these are simply excuses to try to evade the political settlement that has long been possible. That's a political settlement among national groups which exist. One of them has its national existence realized in the state of Israel. The other is under military occupation. If we agree, there's a point of principle here, of course, if we agree that Palestinians have the same human rights as Jews, maybe we don't, but if we agree to that, then there is an obvious form of political settlement, namely the two-state settlement of the sort that we have rejected, that Israel rejects, just as its governing party continues to claim Jordan. Now, I don't think we should back that. I think we should allow a move towards political settlement. It won't be easy. There are a lot of problems, but at least we can begin to move in that direction.
Let me pick another question. And this one, Professor Chomsky, we'll start with you. What do you think the U.S. can and should do to help stop drug trade in Latin America?
Well, one thing we can do to stop drug trade is to stop cooperating with it. So, for example, that won't end it. In fact, it will come nowhere near ending it, but it'll be a good start. So, for example, take, say, General Noriega. He's been well known to be up to his neck in the drug racket since certainly the early 70s, mid-70s at the latest. And he was a very favored U.S. ally until the mid-1980s, long after that. The reason was because he was performing services for us. He was offering a base for the attack against Nicaragua and so on. He ran a totally fraudulent election in 1984. This guy who's right at the top of the the Colombian drug cartel. We rewarded that by sending George Shultz down to bless the occasion as a great step forward in democracy after the fraudulent election. For reasons that are still not entirely clear, but apparently because Noriega at some point stopped following our orders, we decided to turn against him, and incidentally we've achieved the magnificent result of organizing virtually most of Latin America and even the Catholic Church in Panama in favor of Noriega, who they hate because of the form of U.S. intervention. That's a real achievement. But one thing we could have done is to avoid that form of participation in the drug racket. The same is true of the Contra story. There's very little doubt by now, I think the evidence is very convincing, that the Contra-Aid program was tied up with drugs. That's not the first time, incidentally. You look at the history of clandestine warfare, and you find that it's very often linked to the drug racket. There's a very simple reason for that. Covered actions, clandestine actions, require untraceable money. And one of the places you go for untraceable money and for thugs and so on and so forth is to the drug racket. That's why the CIA back in the late 1940s, as part of its efforts to break up the French labor unions, reconstituted the Corsican Mafia, apparently offering as a quid pro quo the reconstitution, the rebuilding of the heroin racket. That's why one of the major centers of the drug trade shifted over to the Golden Triangle in Laos, Thailand, Burma, at the time of U.S. clandestine operations there. And that's why the Contra operations are involved in drugs. Now, this is a small part of it. That's not the whole main source of drugs is coming from elsewhere, but that's a part. So one thing we could do to try to control the drug racket is to stop supporting it. A second thing we can do, and this now becomes more serious, my own view, frankly, is that the only way the drug racket will be controlled is by legalizing it. That's a proposal that's been made repeatedly. I think we're in this has to be thought through carefully. It's not a trivial matter. But I think we're in a situation rather like that of prohibition structurally. The drugs are going to come. The drug racket is linked to powerful financial institutions. Ramon Millan Rodriguez, the accountant for the Colombian cartel, testified not long ago before Congress that he had connections with major American banks. He hardly needed his testimony to know this. I mean, this is a major capitalist institution. It's going to work. It's going to work through existing institutions. If it's illegal, it's also going to build up crime, organized crime and terror. Now, I don't think there's going to be. I really do not think there's going to be any way to control it. It's too closely interlinked with major centers of finance, capital, power, and so on. And I think the only thing we can do is to decriminalize it and try to reduce it in the manner in which the plague of alcoholism, which of course still exists, was decriminalized, thus reducing the power of the criminal elements while not eliminating alcohol. And I am pretty much convinced that that's the direction we're going to have to go if we want to overcome this plague, and it is a plague.
Mr. Perle, what can the United States do to stop the drug trade in Latin America?
Frankly, I'm not either expert or particularly interested in that question, so I won't say more than that I think the idea that we should legalize drugs, and we're not talking now about a little pot, we're talking about hard drugs, is on the theory that this will, that because it is so well protected by capitalist interests, if we legalize it, at least there won't be criminals involved, is an absurd notion. We may not be able to stop the flow from Latin America. We can, to some degree, reduce it, which keeps market prices high, and that may be the best we can hope to accomplish.
This next question, let's start with you, Mr. Perle. You point out that American foreign policy in regards to our NATO allies and Japan was based on the idea of reconstruction and not control. But you fail to take into account the sources of new materials for this reconstruction, namely third world countries, which were directly controlled by the U.S. How then can the United States foreign policy be classified as not being one of controlling other countries when this state of affairs exists?
Look, we have no particular interest, despite the fact that Professor Chomsky continues to assert it and obfuscates when pressed to explain himself, in controlling other countries. He makes it sound as though somehow we benefit from control, and take such an extreme view of it that we would even, in his theory, knowingly and deliberately drive a country that might otherwise not be aligned with the Soviet Union into the arms of the Soviet Union. It is a bizarre theory of American policy. The fact is that we have no particular interest in controlling countries beyond the United States. We have an interest in protecting our security. We do not want to see, obviously, Soviet military forces in Latin America. We have an interest in working together with our allies to try to protect and maintain a stable military balance. But the notion of control, his image of the post-war reconstruction of Europe, where we are accused of eliminating the anti-fascist resistance, and the buzzwords are starting to come out as this debate continues, in order to facilitate American investment. Now, of course, you would have most Europeans accusing us of protectionism and trying to protect our own domestic markets for ourselves. The fact is that we are better off, and it's Professor Chomsky's term, with liberal internationalism, that is, with other countries free and independent and democratic, in a position to interact on a free and independent and voluntary basis with the United States. And the notion that we have anything to gain from control is not only not proven historically, it's rubbish. It's a construct that he builds in order to explain, in order to get at what ultimately is his preference for a different international economic order and a different development model.
Mr. Kamala?
Let me stress again that my preferences are beside the point here. The preference of mine that's relevant in this case is permitting freedom and independence and avoiding forceful intervention of great powers in the interests of their own dominant groups. Now, the question was not reconstruction, but not control. Our policy towards Europe, there's enormous documentation on this now, I should say, was reconstruction with control. So we wanted to reconstruct Europe and Japan, but in a particular fashion. We wanted to reconstruct something like the old order, but now not hostile to us, rather integrated into the grand area. Remember, that's not my term, that's the State Department Council of Foreign Relations term that we were trying to develop. Hence, repeatedly, in country after country, we moved to undermine the anti-fascist resistance, which was largely animated by one or another idea of radical democracy or socialism or whatever. Sometimes this was done with extreme violence, as in, say, Greece and South Korea. Other times it was done by subversion, as, say, in France. Sometimes it was done by actual partition. The United States, one of the reasons why the United States was rather favorable to partition of Germany, and indeed may have initiated it, was that it was understood that a unified Germany would have a powerful labor movement. That's discussed carefully, I should say, in internal documents of the period, which have now been declassified. We wanted to reconstruct a particular form of social order in the industrial capitalist countries, one in which liberal internationalism would prevail, guaranteeing our dominance given the balance of power at the time. Mr. Perle points out that now we're moving towards a degree of protectionism. That's true, because the relative power no longer guarantees our dominance. And here again I suggest that we look at all of this in a broader historical perspective. It's been absolutely traditional for a couple hundred years since modern industrial capitalism developed. It's been traditional for those who believe they're going to win in the competition to be in favor of free trade. Now, there's even a standard name for this in the scholarly literature. It's called the imperialism of free trade, referring in particular to the British Empire. The British Empire, during the period when Britain was being established as as the world's major industrial power, the rape of India and so on, they were not at all in favor of free trade. By the early part of the 19th century, when England became the workplace of the world, the dominant industrial power, it became in favor of free trade on the assumption that its domestic investors and so on would win out in any competition. By about the 1920s, when England was no longer able to compete with Japan, it turned against free trade. In fact, closed off the empire to Japanese penetration. And that's exactly the story that we're reliving. As long as it was assumed that the United States' U.S. interests would effectively win out in any competition, as in fact they did for many decades, we were all in favor of freedom of trade. Now that it's not at all clear that they're going to win out in competition, we naturally turn to some other forms of protectionism, just as we were highly protectionist in the 19th century, when we had to develop our own industrial system by blocking British steel imports. Nothing very surprising about this. Perfectly standard. If we didn't have the documentary record which explains it, we would know it anyhow, just by looking at the historical record. With regard to the Third World, that meant exactly what was stated. It's got to be available for exploitation, for the reconstruction of industrial capitalism in the manner in which we want it reconstructed. That's part of the reason for the continual intervention and violence in the Third World, the attacks on democracy, the attacks on freedom, the slaughters, whether it's Indonesia in 1965 or Central America today, the repeated interventions in places like Guatemala. That's the reason for it. It's the way to maintain a certain kind of world order, a world order in which U.S.-based interests will in fact prosper. That's been the purpose. It's not terribly surprising.
Let me pursue that, Professor Chomsky, with this question. Your summary of U.S. foreign policy in the post-war period implies a level of rationality, efficiency, and unswerving purpose at variance with the widespread perceptions of that policy, which frequently seems irrational, ineffective, and oscillating in character. What group do you see as driving force behind this policy, and how has it been so singularly effective in pushing its program?
Well, we can identify exactly who was involved. I mean, in fact, in the 1940s and the early 50s, there was quite sophisticated planning, I should say. this was a period of considerable intelligence. If you read the documentary record, you see thoughtful, careful planning of a kind which I've sampled. Now, it's not that they didn't make mistakes. You know, the world's a complicated place, and there were many mistakes, but it was largely successful in the interests that they attempted to achieve, the interests that I've described. As to identifying the people involved, that's easy. You can even find their names, you know. But more interesting than their names is the institutions they represented. Overwhelmingly, they're drawn from a small number of corporations, investment firms, half a dozen law firms that represent primarily corporate interests, people who had a broad picture of the needs of U.S.-based corporations, which, of course, dominate the state system, not surprisingly. That's the interest they represented. That's the world they organized. Now, you can say you like the world or you can say you hate it, but that's the world they organized with considerable thoughtfulness and, in fact, a lot of success. Now, since that period, it's been mostly a matter of following out the lines of policy that were already established. So, for example, in the case of Southeast Asia, we happen to have a very rich documentary record, reaching, in fact, way beyond the officially declassified materials because of the opening up of the Southeast Asia files after the Pentagon Papers affair. And what you see there, if you look, is simply the application of principles already established to this specific case, with very little innovative thinking, I should say. Today, we don't know what the planning is because we don't have the documents available, but you can make it out. You can make it out by by watching the events unfold. The United States is, since the economic damage caused to the United States by the Vietnam War, they didn't know that was going to be so costly. Since that time, the U.S. economy has been in trouble. It's been necessary to expand the role of the state in protecting the relatively competitive sectors of the U.S. economy. We are moving towards a kind of protectionism. The major protectionism in the United States, in fact, is the support for high technology industry. We in the United States, we have a system of a state-protected market, state-guaranteed market for high technology production, a system for forcing a public subsidy to high technology production, in particular the costly research and development aspect of high technology production. That's called the Pentagon. It's not just for producing weapons. So take a look at the history of the computer industry. You'll discover that in the 1950s, the core of any modern industrial society. You look in the 1950s when computers were not marketable, really. The support for research and development of computers was 100% the military system. By the 1960s, computers became sellable on the market. So that support by the state, forced subsidy through the state, reduced to approximately 50%. Now we're engaged in the development of what's called fifth-generation computers, big, huge computer development competing with Japan and so on. The state contribution shot up again. It's now approximately 100% for research and development through the Pentagon, NASA, which is just the front for the Pentagon, and the Department of Energy, which is primarily using them for the production of nuclear weapons. That's the system that we use to create a protected market for the parts of the economy that still function. And under the Reagan administration, which in fact is highly protectionist and highly committed to state intervention, this system expanded radically. That's our system of, called military Keynesianism, of developing, protecting the parts of the economy that in fact function. It's a costly system. The Reaganite economic management, which was particularly disastrous, had the effects of, as you know, of turning the United States into a tremendous debtor country after having been the world's major creditor, of seriously affecting the trade balance and so on, and those are costs that we'll have to bear, but that's what comes from this kind of protectionism. I mean, particularly in the Reagan administration, we've succeeded in combining some of the worst features of state-run economies, inefficiencies and so on, with some of the worst features of private capitalism. It's a real achievement.
Okay. Ms. Perle, there's an economic power elite which provides the consistency in American foreign policy. Your response? Well,
of course, it is a lot more complicated than Professor Chomsky thinks it is. the making of American foreign policy is subject to a great many influences other than the room full of capitalist lawyers, bankers, and corporate executives that he conjures up, who in his view of the world have since 1945 been manipulating American policy in order to serve their own selfish financial interests. It's a simple enough model. It's a model that is intended to appeal. He keeps referring to the documents that prove it. He keeps coming back to the Policy Planning Council at the Department of State. I've served in government for a good many years now, and I've never yet seen a Policy Planning Council document that interested anyone except the authors at the Policy Planning Council. And anyone who thinks that American policy is based on the implementation of Policy Planning Council documents has never had the experience of either seeing one of those documents or grappling with the problem of implementing American foreign policy. There is no power elite of the kind that Professor Chomsky suggests there is manipulating the world in the interests of American capitalism. You're perfectly free to accept that model if you like, but no one who's had any association with the policy process would believe it for a minute.
Do you have an alternative notion of the policy process?
Well, as the question implied, there is a great deal that goes into the making of policy that includes things like imperfect knowledge and not necessarily understanding the social and political forces with which we're dealing. There are mistakes, to be sure. There's a lot of idealism in the process. People who believe that the United States ought to make sacrifices of various kinds in order to assist in the expansion of democracy around the world, and we've gotten ourselves into some trouble from time to time in an effort to accomplish that. But if you listen to Mr. Chomsky, you think that we are motivated entirely by a kind of rapacious elite looking after their own interests, and it's complete nonsense, of course.
A question, we'll start with you, Mr. Perle, about terrorism. And what is terrorism? Does 170-plus dead Palestinians killed by settlers and Zionist troops qualify as terrorism? How about 700-plus dead South African youth in 1976 in South Africa? Is this terrorism? Does 40,000 dead Nicaraguans qualify as terrorism? If not, please explain.
Is that applause, I take it, is for the question and not for my answer. Let me say this. Whatever terrorism is, I would not define it in such a manner as to confuse acts by the PLO against non-combatants, frequently children, with action taken by George Washington in the American War of Independence. Now, it does seem to me that the essence of the concept of terrorism is an attack against non-combatants. That is, an attack against people who are not involved, not directly parties to a conflict. And one of the things that I object to in the analogy suggested by Professor Chomsky is the failure to recognize that when the PLO attacks a bus full of civilians, including children, and murders them, that is not in any way to be compared with a struggle for independence.
Okay.
May I comment on that one?
Well,
Sure.
I've given a definition of terrorism. You can apply it to those situations.
May I?
Sure.
I think that here again I'll unfortunately refer to U.S. documents, which I think are quite good. The U.S. Code has an official definition of terrorism. I think it's a pretty good one. State Department and Army documents, for example, the Army Manual Countering Terrorism, have good definitions of terrorism. I think we ought to keep to it. Basically, without quoting all the words, it comes down to just what you said. The threat or use of force to coerce and intimidate civilian populations. That's terrorism. Now, that would it would include, in fact, George Washington's actions. For example, they perhaps went beyond terrorism, like the destruction of the Iroquois civilization in 1779, the rampaging of Green's armies, and so on. I don't say that particularly critically. I really don't know of any national movement that didn't involve terrorism. But let's keep up until today. I agree with you that when the PLO attacks civilians, that's terrorism. Similarly, when the United States directs its proxy army, as it's called in internal documents again, when it directs its proxy army to attack soft targets, the words of General John Galvin testifying to Congress a year or two ago, to attack soft targets and not to, going on, to duke it out with the Sandinistas directly, that is to avoid defended targets and attack soft targets, that's terrorism. When Charles Redmond of the State Department spokesman endorses publicly the attack of our proxy forces against agricultural collectives on the grounds that there are some people with arms defending them, that's advocacy of terrorism, just as it would be if Gaddafi endorsed the attack of the attacks by the PLO against Israeli collectives, which are far better armed than the cooperatives that we're attacking. All that's terrorism. When former CIA Director Stansfield Turner testified before Congress in 1985 on this, he simply referred to our attack against Nicaragua as terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism. That's giving us the benefit of the doubt, I should say. If you take the World Court decision seriously, it may pass beyond terrorism to the much more serious crime of aggression, unlawful use of force. But giving the U.S. the benefit of the doubt, it's large-scale terrorism. When the PLO attacks a bus and kills civilians, that's terrorism. When Israel bombs civilian targets in the Bekaa Valley, killing with hundreds of maybe 400 casualties, including children killed in a bombed-out schoolhouse, mosques destroyed, markets destroyed, and so on, that's terrorism. In fact, there's plenty of terrorism in the world. By and large, the terrorism, it's a roughly fair generalization, that the more powerful the entity involved, the more terrorism it carries out. There are exceptions, but there's no doubt that we're doing quite well in that conflict. I might point out that we're one of the few countries in the world that's officially committed to terrorism. There are other terrorist states, but I want to stress that the United States has an official commitment to terrorism. The attack against the commitment to attack soft targets, such as agricultural cooperatives, that's an official commitment to terrorism. In fact, if you take a look at the U.S. Army published manuals on low-intensity conflict, the policy we're officially committed to, you will notice that the definition of low-intensity conflict happens to be almost word for word the definition of terrorism. The use of measures short of aggression to coerce and intimidate the population. That's low-intensity conflict. Take a look at the definitions. It's not that we're the only terrorist state, but we're ranked rather high in the competition for major terrorist power.
Mr. Perle?
I don't have anything to add to that.
Have a question. Let's start with you, Professor Chomsky. The Nicaraguan government official who recently defected has stated that regardless of peace efforts, the Nicaraguan government will pursue a policy of military expansion with the Soviet Union. Why or why shouldn't with the Soviet Union? Why or why shouldn't we believe their claims that this is to be a defensive force?
Well, he's speaking of Colonel Miranda, who did not state, read the documents that he produced, he did not state or in any way imply that Nicaragua was intending, regardless of peace, to carry out a policy of military expansion with the Soviet Union. What Miranda stated, true or false, was the following. First, in fact, the only newsworthy and, in fact, novel statement that he produced was that the United States had been vastly exaggerating the number of Cuban and Soviet advisors in Nicaragua, which is much lower than what the United States had claimed, according to him, and approximately what Nicaragua had stated. He said that if in the coming years, if the Contra war declines, Nicaragua would reduce the size of its military forces. That was what he stated. It would reduce the size of its military forces, and it would provide light arms to the civilian population to defend the country against the threat which continues and is constantly raised, the threat of a possible U.S. military invasion. That means they would try to turn the country into something roughly like Israel, a nation under arms, but of course at a much lower level of military armament. He stated that Nicaragua was the only place where the Soviet Union came into this. He stated that Nicaragua intended to obtain MiG aircraft, jet interceptors. However, he did not state, and you can easily discover if you want, that Nicaragua would be delighted to obtain French Mirage interceptors. They've repeatedly said that. They don't care whether the interceptors they get come from France or the Soviet Union. They'd, in fact, prefer to get them from France because that would terminate the propaganda about their being a client of the Soviet Union. So the fact is they want jet interceptors. Since we've blocked our allies from sending them to them, they're going to turn to the Soviet Union. Why do they need jet interceptors? Well, because at that time, for all we know today, but certainly at that time, the CIA was flying planes into Nicaragua at the level of 2 to 3 a day to provide supplies for the terrorist forces that we had established in the country. That's an enormous supply effort. It was combined with an enormous surveillance effort to provide the Contras with information in real time, sophisticated communication equipment, to provide them with information in real time about the deployment of Sandinista forces so they could proceed to attack soft targets in accord with our directives. And it's well known that the only way that they can try to protect their territory against constant military intrusion by the United States is with jet interceptors. There's no other way to do it. Yes, they're trying to defend their territory. That's essentially the gist of the Miranda exposures. It's kind of interesting that the United States regarded that as scandalous. See, we regard it as scandalous for any country to be able to defend themselves against our attack. If any country tries to obtain planes from France or anyone else to defend itself against our attack, that's a scandal. We've got to destroy them. How can we tolerate this threat to our existence? Let me suggest a question to you. Take the way we talk about this Miranda exposure and about Nicaragua in general, and let's try the following thought experiment. Suppose that there was a debate going on in the Soviet Union about Luxembourg, in which they said, look, Luxembourg is an advanced industrial power linked to the United States, part of a hostile military alliance, Denmark even worse, planes and so on and so forth, tremendous threat to Soviet security. Obviously, we've got to organize a terrorist force to undermine them. Maybe, in fact, given the scale of the threat they pose as compared with the threat Nicaragua poses to us, maybe we would actually, nuke them or something like that. If a debate then, in fact, suppose it went on to say, well, look, if Luxembourg or Denmark obtain jet planes, well, then obviously we've got to bomb them into the sea. How can we tolerate that kind of threat? If a discussion like that were going on in the Soviet Union, how would we react? As far as I know, non-existent Soviet discussion, and see what conclusions you draw about our own political culture from that.
Mr. Perle, what about, shouldn't we believe a defecting Nicaraguan official about their intentions to follow a policy of military expansion with the Soviet Union?
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask each of you to make a brief comment about one concluding question, and then I'll ask for final summary statements. And the final question that I would put to each of you is, pick either area that we've talked about, either Nicaragua and Central America or the Middle East, and say in a few sentences what the United States foreign policy in that area should be now. What would you propose? Mr. Perle, may we start with you?
Well, I happen to think that, broadly speaking, American policy in the Middle East has been aimed and continues to be aimed at trying to help bring about a settlement of the principal disputes that plague that part of the world. In particular, the dispute between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors and the PLO. But I think we have chosen the right basis upon which to attempt to do that, which is a change of a fundamental nature in the threat that an irredentist PLO committed to the destruction of Israel would pose. Professor Chomsky says it isn't an issue of security. It is very much an issue of security. It's all very well to sit in Columbus, Ohio, and say it's not an issue of security. But there have been a number of wars already in the Middle East, each one of which potentially threatened the survival of the Jewish population of the State of Israel, and I think the Israelis have a right to insist on security arrangements that have some hope and some promise of stability, and the United States has by and large been right in supporting those same objectives. It is more than a trivial matter when one talks about the legitimacy of one's right to exist, because as Professor Chomsky knows full well, until the legitimacy of that right to exist is acknowledged, any settlement, any political or territorial settlement, will at best be a temporary settlement in the context of the larger effort to destroy the very existence of a Jewish state in Palestine. And I think the United States is quite right not to align itself with pressures to that end.
Thank you. After Professor Chomsky responds, I'm going to ask you to make the opening concluding remark in about 5 minutes.
So that should be sometime around breakfast.
Okay.
By my reckoning.
I'll try to make it in time for a midnight snack.
Briefly, Professor Chomsky.
Well, let me talk about Israeli security, which I think we should be concerned about. Let me repeat that the comments on Israeli security that I was referring to were not my judgments. They were the judgments of the expressed in the cabinet meetings and other planning sessions that have been amply documented in the scholarly literature in Israel in Hebrew. For they did not see the issue of security, and rightly so. Because as former head of military intelligence General Harkabi and others will explain to you and do explain to you, the problem of a Palestinian state is not one of security. A demilitarized Palestinian state, which is what it will be, contained in a hostile Jordanian-Israeli military alliance, will undoubtedly improve the security of Israel. But that's not the whole point. See, in my view, here we probably do differ. It's not just the security of Israel that's at stake. Peace in that region will improve the security of Israel. I think that's pretty likely. And steps towards peace would be a step towards Israeli security. But that's not the only issue. There happen to be Palestinians there. There's an indigenous population. And their security counts every bit as much as the security of the Jewish population. So, you know, all of this talk about you're sitting here and not talking about them, if I were to resort to the same rhetorical technique, I would say, I do not do this is conditional, I would say, well, it's very nice to sit here and talk about the security of the Palestinians in refugee camps. That's not the point. We should be concerned with the security of the Israelis and of the Palestinians, and I think there's an obvious way to maximize, not of course guarantee, that security. With regard to the question of legitimacy, if the failure to recognize the legitimacy of Israel, this new concept in international affairs, if that excludes the PLO, then plainly Israel's excluded from the negotiations as well, because it not only refuses to accept the legitimacy of Palestinian nationalism, it even refuses the lower demand, much lower one, of accepting the request of the PLO for negotiations leading to mutual recognition. In fact, it refuses even to allow the Palestinians to choose their own representatives for eventual negotiations. And it is not only putting these forth as statements, it is acting to implement them. Finally, last comment. Even if we were to accept this innovation in international affairs and demand that the Palestinians not only recognize Israel, which they've already stated long ago they're willing to do, but recognize the legitimacy of their dispossession from their homes, even if we impose this extra and novel burden on them, can anyone seriously believe that such a statement, such a verbal statement, would improve the security of Israel? That's living in a dream world. Security is not based on verbal statements made by some leader under duress. Security is based on arrangements that are created among states and other groups, not on some empty verbiage. Even if they were to produce this statement, it would not contribute one iota to the security of Israel. In fact, it's obvious, and it tells us exactly what the point of those demands is. The point of those demands is to place further roadblocks in the way of a political settlement.
Now for the 5-minute concluding statements, we'll start with Mr. Richard Perle. The podium is yours.
I have sat this evening and listened at, I think, probably greater length than I would have desired to a vision of a world that I have never seen in my years in government, to the vision of a world in which a small number of men foolishly, in order to enrich themselves, are prepared to inflict suffering and cruelty throughout the world. This is not a policy that I recognize. I trust that for most of you it's not a policy that you recognize. I have heard it said that the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is a front for the Pentagon, that the United States has committed atrocities comparable to Pol Pot, that Europe is a quasi-democratic order, that the reconstruction of the post-war world was done for the convenience and the benefit of a few self-interested men who cared nothing about values, nothing about democratic institutions, nothing about the well-being of anyone beyond themselves. I've even heard it said that when the U.S. managed to assist in an agreement between Egypt and Israel that followed 3 wars and much destruction between those 2 countries, that was intended to assist Israel to retain a military occupation. It's a deeply cynical view of the world, a view said to derive from documents, but I must say to you from a profound misreading of documents. It is a view that recognizes no decency in the making of American policy or its implementation. It is hardly in the interests of enlightenment on this occasion to go through refuting point by point the documents I've not seen. That seems to me quite beside the point. You know from your own experience, you know from your own observations what the people of this country represent, and by and large, although mistakes get made from time to time, and in any human organization mistakes will be made, I think you know and understand what the American people represent and what their elected leaders represent. They do not represent what Professor Chomsky says they represent. And if you believe that that is what this country is all about, if you believe that we are organized principally to serve the selfish interests of a few, and that the historical experience of this country since the war has been dedicated and devoted to that, then I think you will have a lot of difficulty explaining the enormous prosperity, the benefits of democracy that this country has managed to bring to much of the world. And I ask you, as you depart this evening, to consider whether the world you've heard described tonight by Professor Chomsky bears any relationship to the world in which you live and make observations of your own. Thank you.
And now for the 5-minute concluding statement from Professor Noam Chomsky.
Well, I finally found something that Mr. Perle said that I agreed with. Our discussion so far has been relatively, at least, cool and abstract and antiseptic. We have not looked into the eyes of the victims, as is often the case, the terrorized peasants, the slum dwellers of El Salvador. They've been remote from our consciousness. The maimed victims of the forces we send out to attack soft targets in Nicaragua, the children with broken limbs in a Gaza hospital, a peasant woman trying to cook in the rain in the ruins of her home demolished in collective punishment in what Israel, with our aid, is turning into a vast concentration camp. Having just returned from the West Bank, and shortly before from Central America, These images do happen to be vivid in my mind. I haven't talked about them. I'd like to use these last few moments just to outline the radical shift in policy that I think American citizens should induce our government to undertake, and we have ways to do it. With regard to Nicaragua, I think we should follow the advice of the leading democratic figure in Central America, Jose Figueres, who was the founder of Costa Rican democracy. He returned recently from a trip to Nicaragua, which he described as an invaded country, and he called upon the United States to allow the Sandinistas to finish what they started in peace. They deserve it. For the first time, he said, Nicaragua has a government that cares for its people, one that was elected as freely as anyone else in Central America except for Costa Rica. He found a surprising amount of support for the government, he said, despite the destruction of the economy caused by U.S. terror and economic warfare. As is understood throughout the world, this is the reason why the United States government has been unable to convert its proxy army into a guerrilla force, despite the unprecedented support lavished upon them, vastly beyond anything available to authentic popular or guerrilla movements. We should put aside our reliance on violence and our defiance of international law. We should terminate our dedicated efforts to block peaceful settlement in Central America. We should offer large-scale reparations for recovery from the destruction for which we are responsible. With regard to El Salvador, we should listen to the Archbishop, who calls upon the government we established to accept the offer for negotiations on the part of the indigenous guerrilla forces and to halt what he calls the escalating terror of the death squads, as he now does. We should heed the church-based human rights organization that denounces the continuing state terror and describes Salvadoran society as, I'm quoting, affected by terror and panic, a result of the persistent violation of basic human rights, a society living under collective intimidation and generalized fear that accepts the frequent appearance of tortured bodies because basic rights, the right to life, has absolutely no overriding value for society. We should attend to the recent polls taken by the Jesuit University of San Salvador, which show that 95% of the population prefer economic and humanitarian aid over military aid of any kind, and that 75% oppose both of the political parties that are permitted to function under U.S.-backed state terror called here democracy. The same is true with regard to Guatemala and Honduras, which, like El Salvador, remain under effective military rule behind a thin civilian facade which is erected primarily to extort money from Congress for the benefit of the wealthy and the privileged. In the Middle East, we should reverse our policy of unswerving rejectionism. We should join the very broad international consensus favoring a political settlement with a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza within a regional settlement, with the Palestinians permitted to select their own representatives for negotiations. That means the PLO, which has every bit as much legitimacy as the Zionist organization did in 1947. More generally, we should have the courage and the honesty to face some truths about ourselves and what we do in the world, even if those are unpleasant truths. We should ask why the United States rejects the World Court decision calling on it to refrain from the unlawful use of force against Nicaragua, why we veto resolutions at the United Nations Security Council calling on all states to observe international law, and why we repeatedly stand alone, or almost alone, in the General Assembly on issues of peace, disarmament, and observance of law. We should ask why we have consistently sought to remove conflicts from the arena of politics and diplomacy to the arena of violence, where we can hope to prevail. We should ponder the meaning of the fact that, as studies have repeatedly shown, U.S. foreign aid correlates closely with torture and egregious human rights violations, and not with need, that it has been used for a form of development that leaves the majority of the population in greater misery and destitution. We might even consider the advice offered over 20 years ago by Marine Commandant David Shoup, who said with regard to Vietnam that the best contribution we can make to its people is to get our bloody dollar-crooked hands out of their affairs. And if we can achieve this much, we should consider how we might begin to play a constructive role in the lives of miserable and suffering people throughout the world, instead of treating them as instruments to serve our purposes, or more accurately, the purposes of those elite groups that shape U.S. policies in their interests, not yours or mine. We should consider how the fear of the Soviet Union has been exploited to gain support for intervention and terror, just as fear of the United States has been exploited to similar ends by our global adversary. And we should ask what we can do to reverse this system of tacit cooperation in global oppression. We should begin to raise some fundamental questions about ourselves and our institutions and ask how they can change so they can become responsive to our true interests, which are not different from those who suffer at our hands. By world standards, we happen to be very free of state and other coercion, and that means that we have means available to learn about ourselves and to act to reverse a course that has brought us shame and has plunged many others into misery. We cannot appeal to fear of repression if we fail to undertake such efforts, but only to selfishness and cowardice. More than any other power, we have the resources to contribute to freedom, human rights, and social and economic development, just as we have the power to destroy and oppress, which is just what the United States government will continue to do if its citizens choose the easy path of obedience and apathy. Ample opportunities are open to us. Our willingness to make use of them will determine the fate of many millions of suffering people in the world, ultimately our own as well.
Thank you. I think it's important to ask a question at this point in our evening together as to what the purpose of dialogue is in the academy. And perhaps the important thing to bear in mind is to be clear what it's not. We in the American society are accustomed to sport events where we go and root for our favored side. Watch the boxer lay a glove on his opponent. Certainly that cannot be the purpose of dialogue and debate in the academy. Instead, our commitment is to invite thoughtful people to lay bare for us alternative visions of our world and how we relate to it. And then, with that sharpened relief, to engage in a thought process ourselves as to indeed the kind of role we wish to play. I think it's noteworthy to observe that both of our speakers urged us tonight to observe the world, to go out and find out for ourselves how it is, and to check what we see with our own preliminary judgments. So, in the spirit of contributing to that exercise, I want to thank both of our speakers, Mr. Richard Perle, Professor Noam Chomsky, for being with us tonight. And on behalf of the